Hello, I'm Anthony. Today I'm going to try to answer the question, what recording level should you use when recording audio in Cubase? The inspiration behind this video is a video I made last week in which I talked about my setup more generally, my Cubase setup. And in that video I said that I prefer to record my audio with peaks at around -4 to -6 dB. Now that's pretty hot. And I even said in the video that many people will tell you that you should be recording as low as -20 to give yourself an enormous amount of headroom. What I want to do today is some science. We're going to basically try to answer the question definitively, whether or not it matters, whether we record close to 0 dB or way below 0 dB. Hope you enjoy this video today, and if you do, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to help support my channel, carry on making these videos. And without further ado, let's do some science. I'm going to use a media bass sample today. I've chosen this sample called Cinematic Sequence A flat minor. It's from the Cinematic Electronic Content set in Cubase. So anybody who has, I think it comes with Cubase Pro. I'm not exactly sure which versions it comes with. And there were various criteria that I used for selecting it. Firstly, it's fixed, it's stable, it's there, you can see it. We're not relying on me recording dynamic live audio. We don't need dynamic live audio. Once we have our test audio, I can send that in to as many sources as I want. I wanted something that was pretty dynamic, and I wanted something that was recorded at a pretty high level. This sample meets all of those criteria. Now, for various reasons that I don't fully understand, I can't play audio to you out of the previewer in Media Bay, but I don't need to. This is the sample that I've dragged out of Media Bay. Like I say, it really doesn't matter what it is. As you're going to see today, the audio itself is very important, but the actual content in it isn't. Let's have a quick look at the stats for this file, see what's going on. Now I have a true peak here on the right channel of 0.01 dB. I don't want to go anywhere near true peak danger at all for today's purposes. So I just pulled a little bit off the top end of this sample. I also wanted to convert it into mono because I don't want to deal with any issues to do with panning laws. Very quickly, because it's got nothing to do with today's episode, the panning law states that something in the middle of a stereo field is actually louder than something on the left or right of the stereo field. Not interested in any of that nonsense today. I want a really, really simple test bed. So what I did was, off camera, I converted this sample into a mono sample, and I just trimmed a little bit off the gain. And so if we go down to track number 2, that's what we have here. We have a look at the stats for this file. You can see that I've given myself some headroom, and I've got a big healthy mono signal. Other than that, it's the same file. And so we're now good to go. I've got my test audio file that I'm going to use to basically send back into Cubase. Now again, I did this off camera because it was a little bit difficult for me to actually talk to you through the control room and perform this test. But I did video it so that you can see the integrity of the science that we're doing today. What I basically did was sent this audio out of Cubase and back in to my Focusrite interface via a physical loopback. I've got a couple of cables plugged into inputs 1 and 2 of my Focusrite. So I re-recorded this audio into 2 separate tracks simultaneously. As you can see, loopback L, loopback R, these were inputs 1 and 2 on my Focusrite. I manually set the input levels of my Focusrite inputs such that loopback L recorded as hot as possible without clipping, so it was about -2 dB peaking on my meters when I was doing the prep, and loopback R, I tried to get as close to -18 dB as possible. I'll show you the quick clip of me recording these 2 samples so that you can see what I did. And that was all pretty straightforward, wasn't it? So now we can throw away the original audio entirely. We don't need that anymore. We've now got these 2 new audio files that are basically just re-recordings of exactly the same audio. Firstly, the left-hand channel, Obviously it's playing in mono, so you're hearing it in both ears, but that's basically just fed into input 1 of my Focusrite. Here's exactly the same audio recorded at about -18. Same audio, but it's quieter. Let's have a look at the stats for those two files. Here's the quiet one, and we've got a true peak of -17.7 dB. And here's the hot signal. Let's just make sure that everything is safe. And here we are. I gave myself 1 dB of headroom, but I'm pretty close to 0. So that's a very hot audio signal. Okay, test number 1. Can I get to the situation where when I perform a null test on these two files, I get silence? I'll explain what that means in a little bit, but let's just do the prep first. I'm going to copy these files and then I'm going to bounce them. So I'm making a unique copy of each of these files. I can press O on my keyboard, and that will simply create brand new independent copies of these two audio files. The next thing that I'm going to do is normalize them both. I can press N, and as you can see, I've got my maximum peak level set at -0.1. I'm doing my very best to avoid any danger of going anywhere near intersample peaks. I want to make sure that all of my true peaks are very slightly below 0. So I'm going to normalize to something that's very, very close to 0, but actually not. And that's it, done that job. Head over to sample number 2 and press N again. And that's that sample normalized. So did recording these two audio files at 17 dB's worth of difference have any impact on their output at all? It's a really easy way to verify that, and this is what the null test is. We open the mix console. I'm going to invert the phase of the right-hand channel. Don't forget, they're both mono, but I've called them L and R. So these two audio tracks now are identical, but out of phase. Let's play them both back together. If I turn the stereo out way up, I mean, way up, that is a really, really hot signal. You can just about hear there's a tiny amount of non-cancelled signal there. I think that's probably something to do with the very minor noise floor difference between these two audio files. The fact that the -18 dB file was recorded so quietly. Maybe there's some difference with the noise floor, but I'm going to consider that to be a successful null test. At the normal kind of volumes at which I'm talking to you, that's pretty silent. In fact, you can probably hear there's a truck outside. That's probably louder than the audio that you're hearing here. Just to verify that everything is absolutely kosher, I'm going to mute each of these tracks and then you'll hear the other one. So they really are there, they really are playing. It's only the fact that they're out of phase that means we're not hearing anything. So I'm really happy with that. That's some pretty good science we've just done there. We've verified that recording an audio signal at pretty much -18 dB, you can see visibly, let's make these tracks a bit bigger, the dramatic difference, visual difference in these two files actually doesn't have any impact when we come to increase the volume arbitrarily simply by normalizing, which basically means we're just increasing the volume of this thing so that it plays at very close to 0 dB. We've had no impact on the audio at all. We've basically not lost any audio fidelity by recording this thing at -18. Another way to look at that is that we've not done any harm to that audio by recording it at close to 0. So they're both completely viable solutions up to this point. We need to determine, kind of from a process perspective, whether or not one's better than another. The next thing I'm going to do is to add some inserts. Let's open my mix console. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do all of my processing on the hot signal. It really doesn't matter which one I've picked, but I've just basically chosen to play with loopback L, which is the original hot signal. And I'm going to add a couple of EQs. I've chosen to use the Pro Q because it's my kind of go-to EQ. It actually advertises kind of in the blurb that it has effectively infinite headroom. So the Pro Q itself isn't going to get in the way of my test, but that's not really what I'm asking it to do. What I'm going to do with these two EQs is increase the gain on the track by 10 dB on the first insert, and then take that gain away using the second insert. So for a period of time, and that's why I've left this kind of empty slot to sort of indicate this kind of moment in time between the two plugins, I've boosted this gain past 0 dB. This signal is already big, already very close to 0 dB. I've just added 10 decibels onto the signal coming out of this thing. It's going to redline like crazy. I haven't made any other change to the project. There are the two audio files in the background. Let's listen to these two tracks. Absolute silence. So it doesn't matter that during this signal chain on part of this track, when we got past insert number 2, which is this EQ, you can see it redlining, clipping for days, makes absolutely no impact on the sound. Cubase has internal headroom to enable me to go past 0 dB. As long as I sort that situation out before I get to the outside world, when we sum these two audio tracks together, they're still identical. Let's just verify that quickly. There's loopback L, and there's loopback R. And there's them both playing together. For my next test, I need to add a couple of new tracks. Let's make these a bit smaller. And I'm going to add a couple of group tracks to these loopback channels. And this is going to allow me to do some routing. Let's open the mixer again. So super simple. L is going into group L and out. R is going into group R and out. I want to know if passing from one channel to another inside Cubase, that can cause any issues. So I'm going to increase the gain of loopback L by 6 dB, push it basically as far as I can. And on my group track, I'm going to drop the input gain by 6 dB. So the signal coming into the group track is going to be hot. It's going to be clipping. Well, it's going to be redlining. Is it actually going to clip the audio? Am I going to suffer any consequence by passing from one track to another with a signal in excess of 0 dB? Let's find out. Nope. You can see the evidence. As always, we can do a quick audio test to solo these groups. The audio is still playing in the background. Everything is still exactly as it was. Redlining for fun. Complete silence. So Cubase's internal headroom appears to be universal. It doesn't matter whether you're in the middle of a track, boosting a signal temporarily past 0, or passing that audio signal onto another track. The pre-gain channel, let's shut this down, in the mixer, allows you to mitigate any possible issues you might have with exceeding 0 dB. This pre-gain prevents you from losing any audio fidelity at all. Just to clarify, loopback L is completely unaffected here. Okay, I flipped the phase, big deal. That has absolutely no impact on any aspect of the audio. The quality of the audio itself is exactly as it was originally recorded. Just how far can we push this? Let's really go for it with these EQs. I'm going to go up to plus 24. I'm going to leave the second EQ alone, so I'm going up by 24, down by 10, up by another 6. So now my total reduction on the pre-gain is going to need to be minus 20. Let's see if that works. Yep. So these processes just do not care what your audio level is, what your input gain structure is. Cubase has this effectively infinite. I mean, you're not going to push a signal this hot ever. Plus 30 dB is absolutely insane. And we're still listening to silence. I do apologise about the truck outside. It's kind of sullying the purity, the beauty of the test, but there is a massive lorry outside. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm also curious whether or not it matters where the phase inversion is. So let's get it running again. And we'll change the phase inversion somewhere else. So we'll take it off here. You'll suddenly hear both of those sounds being summed. And then cancelled out again. So here's me adding the phase. There will have been a little bit of distortion there because when those two signals are summed together, obviously they're louder than they should be. But cancelled the phase, inverted the phase on my group channel now. It doesn't matter. As long as the audio signal's been flipped at some point, we're accomplishing the same goal. Just going to clean the battlefield a little bit. Got a bit messy here. I'm going to turn this pre-gain back down to -10. I'm going to mute one of these two inserts. I'm going to set the remaining insert to +10 and set my channel strip back to 0. So now I've got a simpler version of the same thing, adding 10 dB on using the Pro Q, taking it back off with the pre-gain. Once again, silence reigns. The next test is that I'm going to add a compressor to each of these tracks. And for my first test, I'm going to use an 1176 variant. I've just realised as I'm adding these inserts in, I hope the mic's not been cutting out. It's difficult for me to catch that. But I always have to try to remain silent if I'm adding an insert to one of these channels. Okay, so I've got two different inserts. I'm going to leave them in their completely default position. Let's press play. Okay, now we're hearing noise. But of course, we'd expect to hear noise. These compressors are doing different amounts of work. They've got the same threshold, and yet different signals are being sent into them. The signal from channel L is much hotter, and therefore you can see on the meter it's compressing and channel R isn't. So let's adjust the input levels to compensate for the 10 decibel difference. Now the terminology on the 1176 is a little bit odd, but I basically need to turn up the input gain to -38. I'm basically making this compressor work 10 dB harder than compressor L. Let's see if that has any impact. Silence. Just verify everything is still there. Yep. So the 1176 is basically a predictable compressor. It's doing the same job every time. It doesn't matter what size of signal is coming into the track, because it has an input adjustment that allows you to say, okay, this signal L is 10 dB hotter than signal R. Compensate for that using the input knob. From that point onwards, the journey that those two signals take through the signal path is identical, and as you hear, it sums to 0. Now, I ended up giving myself a bit of a headache when I was studying these results because I thought, hang on a minute, we've got different output levels here because input and output in default mode are linked. So how come the makeup gain isn't making one channel louder than the other? It's just a feature of the 1176. This is the terminology that this device uses. The simple truth of the matter is the signal coming out of this device is 10 dB bigger than the signal coming out of this device. We know that because we're lopping off 10 dB on the pre-gain on the group track and then nulling to 0. So we can say definitively, we know for a statement of fact that the signals coming out of these two compressors are identical except for their volume. If that wasn't true, they wouldn't null to 0. I'm not doing anything else to the signals. But I did want to do a little bit of a sanity check on it because these output controls are a little bit odd. So I decided to try a different compressor. Let's do one more kind of positive test, then we'll have a look at it from a different perspective. This time I'm going to use the diode 609. Similar kind of thing, I'm going to use the default settings for both compressors. Ratio 2:1, very, very simple compression. Doesn't really matter what the settings are. It's all about the thresholds, but this interface is a little bit more kind of easy to understand. I'm going to set compressor number 1 to 22, -22 dB, and compressor number 2 to -32. Let's listen to them. You can see both of the meters working identically. The threshold, the 10 dB threshold between the two compressors is compensating for the difference of volume, and we are summing to 0. So the 609 is another positive test. Now, it is quite easy to find devices that don't work. The API 2500, for instance. I was unable to get this compressor to perform in the same way that the others were. So these are the default presets. Let's adjust the thresholds by 10 dB. And as you can hear, there is a very slight difference between these two. By manually manipulating these thresholds, I was able to get it to the stage where they were nearly silent. As you can see, I've got the thresholds of 8.5, 8.47 and minus 5.9. The only presumption that I can make is that something about the internal construction of this device, and obviously it's an emulation of a real-world piece of kit, there must be variable factors in here, something where the signal path isn't as consistently reliable as in the other two emulations. That's fine. You know, the world of analog is all to do with like not being perfect all of the time. So I'm perfectly happy to accept that that some plugins won't pass this test. I don't think that subverts the validity of the results at all, but I did want to show you that I had kind of gone to the effort of trying to find instances of devices that don't satisfy this test. One final test that I want to do is using another EQ. So this time I'm going to use a Neve emulation. This is the 1081 preamp. As you can see, I've added the identical default instance to both tracks. Track L still has its 10 dB of boost. Let's have a listen to this. Okay, so we're hearing breakup there. These EQs, or EQL, is clearly overloading. If I take away 10 dB from each track, we null back to silence again. So the signal going into this 1081 is clearly, it's obviously hot. We know it's at plus 10 dB, but the device itself isn't capable of handling that level of signal. It doesn't have infinite headroom. The sound is breaking up and we're hearing those pops and crackles. So I need to mitigate that by either reducing the input gain on this device, or if the plugin that you're sending a signal into doesn't have an input gain that allows you to do this, you would have to drop it using some gain tool. I mean, I've used ProQ here, but any gain reduction tool will do the job. So I guess it's time to draw some conclusions. The conclusion that I draw is that the input level is almost completely irrelevant as long as you don't clip. As long as your input signal doesn't exceed 0 dB, in which case you would get digital clipping and you're not recording the full audio signal. Once that signal is inside Cubase, Cubase is incredibly resilient. It has an enormous headroom for handling what you do to that signal, passing it internally within the realm of Cubase itself. If you pass a very hot signal into a plugin that can't handle it, the 1081 is an example of that. It's going to clip, it's going to be unhappy. So you do need to maintain kind of integrity of your audio chain. You need to make sure that you don't send a hot signal into something that can't handle it. But there's absolutely no penalty, as far as I can tell, in applying gain reduction as required whenever your signal gets too hot. So am I recording my audio too hot? If I have a peak target of -4 to -6 dB, is that too hot? You know what? I think the answer might actually be yes. I might consider bringing that down a little, maybe to -10, just so that if I want to maybe send that into a distortion emulation, for instance, it's going to add some signal on and then subsequently into something like a 1081, I'm not having to worry about pulling that signal down. I have had my fears calmed a little about recording very quiet signals. This -18 dB signal was absolutely fine at every stage of the process today. It never suffered, it never got noisy, and it never did anything that the hotter signal wasn't capable or wasn't doing as well. And so, you know, there is a strong argument for saying drop your headroom, you know, record at a lower volume. But by the same token, I want to see nice, healthy audio signals. This is less useful to me if it's a like thin strip of signal rather than a decent audio. And so some compromise between those two is the absolute ideal. As I say, I'm going to maybe tailor a couple of dB and not quite go so close to zero as I have in the past, now that I know I don't need to. Hope you found this video useful. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.